Okay, so as we start step 2, it mentions the first thing to do is we're going to create our controllers and views for both patient and doctor, right? So if I come up here to controllers, I can right click, add controller. This is what you want, MVC controller with views using entity framework. There are times when we might add an empty controller, but for now, this is definitely what we're after. So I can do both. I can do doctor. Notice it pluralizes it to doctor's controller. That's fine. Sorry, I'm a little off tune. Okay. So there we go. So it created the controller, and under views, we'll see now doctors, and it's created all 5 of these standard views as well, right? So let's do the same thing for patient. Exactly the same choices here, except it's a different class for patient. And of course, it will be the patient's controller. Make sure these are checked off, generate views, etc. Okay, I admit I just paused it while it was cooking there instead of singing my Jeopardy song. Okay, so now I have my controllers, right? Last thing I'm going to do before I run this is come down to shared, right? Because I want to add a link or links to the navigation menu here. Okay, so here's the one I have right now, home and privacy. You know what? I'm not too worried about using the privacy link right now, so I'm going to steal it. Okay, so the controller, I'll do doctor, doctors, sorry, it's a doctor's controller. Remember, it had an S on it. And the action is index to start at the index page. And I'll use that as the text to appear in the link doctors, right? Okay, so that's good. That's my doctors. And maybe I'll just copy this list item here, paste it back in again, and use it for patients. Copy, paste, there we go. All right, so I think I should be ready to give it a test run now. So it's amazing how good, like they've improved this tool from the earlier days of MVC. It gives you pretty much a good layout right from the get-go, right? Now here's our patients, okay, and here's our doctors. So let's just notice a few things. It's not really a problem here for doctors because we only have 3 columns. When I click edit, okay, we seem good. Let's just try something here. Let me just try saving that. Oh, there we go. So there's my error message coming from my data annotation, right? And let's go back to patients. This is a little bit more of a problem. See how things are wrapping around the phone number, the date of birth, and so on. The OHIP number is here and things like that. So there's definitely some problems in the layout of this page. In fact, there's more than one, right? But look at this. Under doctor, ooh, Doogie, Gregory, Charles. I don't have the full names, right? All I have is the first name of the doctor. That's a bit of a problem. And if I click edit or create, right, then I only see the first names here in the drop-down list. Okay. Let me just go back for a second and click the create link. Now, a fair bit of the validation is here already. Okay, can't leave the first name or the last name blank, and so on and so forth. Expected yearly visits, phone number. Yeah, so most of it's required, and we would expect to see those messages. But you know, if you're creating a brand new patient, besides filling in all this information, if I didn't change it, every new patient would be assigned to Gregory House because that's the default here at the top of the drop-down list. That's usually not the best design. When you're creating, you should always have a little prompt here like select a doctor and a validation error that will not be satisfied until they've actually gone through the process of picking from the list an actual doctor to assign, right? That forces them that it's a deliberate decision. It's just not a default that they forgot to change. Otherwise, Doogie gets all the patients, right? So that's a little thing about that. So let me just come back here. So there's a number of issues. Okay, the fact that we're only seeing first names, the fact that Another thing is, I don't think they're in alphabetical order here, are they? Yeah, D, right? So if you had a big long list, you normally want it sorted alphabetically so you can jump to it by typing a letter or two in the list, right? And it's just too cluttered here. There's too much stuff. Not only that, right? We have too many columns to show everything nicely, but some of this information, okay, like OHIP numbers, those are pretty confidential, right? If this is going to be used by your average person at the front desk, maybe you don't want the OHIP number up there on the screen all the time, right? Notice there's a details link, and details basically just gives you a tabular layout here or two columns with, caption and whatnot, and shows you everything, shows you all the properties. So you can always come into details on a patient to see things like the OHIP number, maybe even the phone number, right? Maybe you don't want that sitting on the screen all the time that everyone walking by could see it, right? So there's a number of things we would change, even date of birth. Okay, that can be used for identity theft as well, having somebody's birth date. So perhaps just having their age would be enough to give people at a glance have an idea of the what generation their patient is coming in with or coming from, and hide the actual date of birth itself. So a number of issues with the presentation of data here. Biggest one's probably the fact that it's the first name of the doctor. All right, so that's what we're going to do now is we're going to deal with a number of these issues, in fact, all of them. So let me start with a clean slate. I'm going to close all tabs, and I'll even close this. All right, so let's go back to our views. Remember our models. Remember we've talked before about the dry DRY principle, don't repeat yourself. If you have opportunity to put code in one location, okay, and have it utilized throughout the application, that's always the best thing you can do, right? So if I come into the patient, what we might do is for both patient and doctor, we'll start by adding some summary properties. We've talked about summary properties in courses before. The idea is it might be a combination of existing properties presented in a different way or a more convenient way, right? So for example, okay, when you have a first, middle, last name, why not put it all together into a single expression of the name? So I'm going to put that right here, okay? I'm going to call it full name. Okay, so it just has a getter, so it's read only because there is no setter, right? Returning the first name and the last name, but in the middle, this big long expression. Feel free to write it differently if you want to, but this is the way I've just always done it. It's the way I stole it initially, and I've always used it this way ever since. So we're checking if the middle name is null, right? Then we just substitute a space. Otherwise, we put a space and the first character of the middle name capitalized with a two upper, and then the last name, right? So that's a good representation of the full name. Key points are it's read only. It doesn't have introduce anything. There's not additional data stored in the database. It's just using properties that are here already, right? Another one that's quite useful in a case like this is age. Okay, we have a date of birth, but as we said, that's pretty private information, so why not have age instead? Now, there's multiple ways to try and calculate age, but I like this one that I found on the internet, right? We take today's date time, and then we just compare years and months and so on, and decide, okay, is it actually past the date in the current calendar year or not? Do we have to add one to just this difference in the years or not, right? Now, because we have a nullable, right, date of birth, that's why I'm using a nullable int here, okay? And at the end, we actually convert it back to a string. Now, I am introducing an extra operator here you might not have seen before, but it only takes a moment to talk about. When you have a nullable, remember we said it might be null, it might not, okay? There's always a problem if you have null and you go dot something, you would normally get an error, right? But what they've done is they've added a new operator that allows exactly for that situation. They call it the Elvis operator. Why would they call it the Elvis operator? Well, let me just zoom in really big here in my font and point out, here's one of them here. So thinking of those two blue characters, if you look at it carefully, do you see Elvis's eyes and that little wisp of hair on his forehead? Yes, believe it or not, the guys at Microsoft, guys and gals at Microsoft, actually came up with this name, the Elvis operator, just because of that. Okay, But basically what it means is, okay, if this is null, we will not crash and burn. We'll just not return null. Otherwise, we'll just return the year, right? And it saves you from having to write a whole if structure, testing if it's null and doing code one way, and if it's not null, doing code a different way. So it's a real short form for us, and thankfully they've added that to C#. Okay, so that's using this expression. Feel free to take time. I'm not going to walk you through the whole thing, but it will return a string with the age of the actual patient. Right? Now, if it wasn't a nullable date time, we'd have to make some changes here to get rid of that. Otherwise, it'll say, hey, you can't do this on something that isn't nullable. All right, so we've added two summary properties for the full name and for the age. Now with the doctor, I'm going to add similar ones here, but I'm going to grab both at once out of my copy paste file. By the way, I usually stick, it's not critical. The order of properties in here doesn't matter really. But I usually stick these at the top right after the primary key. Okay, so again, here's my full name, but I've also added DR period because, hey, they are a doctor, right? Doctor, first name, middle initial, last name, right? And if the middle name is null, it just skips over that and puts the space. Formal name. What is a formal name? Well, it's a term that usually refers to when you switch the name around and put last name, comma, first name. And then, of course, I have my optional middle initial, right? Formal names are often used because they work very well alphabetically to find people by their last name and then their first name, right? So with drop-down lists of names, it's a very nice way to present that information. But it also, of course, both of these are combining, once again, nothing new in the database, just existing properties, existing data stored in the database, and they're read-only summary properties. I only need a display name here because I'm not going to likely use the formal name on the screen, right? It's mainly going to be used to populate drop-down lists. So that's why I didn't bother with a display name for formal name, but the full name will often have showing on the screen. So I don't want the field yucky programmers looking full name phrase on the page. I'm going to put the display name doctor instead. Okay, so we've added summary properties, and what we have to do is start using them in the actual user interface, right? So what we're going to do is I'm going to come down here to the views. So maybe I'll start with the patient, okay? Coming to the index view. Now we've had a quick look at these views before, but let me just kind of run over a few things. So at the top, of course, is the model. As a strongly typed view, this is the model for the whole view, is a collection, an IEnumerable collection of patient objects, right? And as we come down in the table header of this layout, we have display name for our different fields, right? And then we have a for each loop where we create rows of data where we actually have display for the different fields, okay? So remember we said the OHIP number and probably even the phone shouldn't be up on the screen all the time. They're available in details when we want them. So the first thing I'm going to do is just delete, take them out. Take it out of the header row, and same with the phone number. Just take that out, okay? Now make sure I do the same thing down here in the for each loop for the actual table rows. Take out OHIP and take out phone. Okay, all right. We want to use our new full name, okay? Both doctor and patient have this full name, okay? So instead of first name, oh, you see there it was actually right in IntelliSense. So by having the full name there, ooh, look at that. Two more columns I can get rid of, okay? Middle name and last name, because they're all incorporated into one. So I'll come down here, do the same thing, change this to full name. And get rid of the other two columns. Now we're really uncluttering this index view quite a bit. What about date of birth? Remember we discussed that as well is kind of private. We don't want it sitting out there on the screen all the time. So instead we'll show the age. And down here, age. Okay. And that's it. That's all I'm going to do on the patient index. But we cut it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. My rule of thumb is 6 or less. Okay, columns should be ever on an index page. Otherwise, it usually gets too cluttered. Okay, so we're doing much better now. And then I'm going to come to the doctor index. And well, I really could leave it, but we did have that full name. So maybe I'll put that on here as the full name instead, right? It does give us the ability. Later on, we're going to add more columns, right? So it's not going to hurt that we have a very sparse page right now because we're going to be adding more as time goes on. Okay, I can copy and paste that. Save me a couple of typos. And there we go. So it's a simple one column. There we are. All right. So that's good. So let me just see here the effect of that work. So we go to doctors. There we go. So we have our nice expression here with the doctor and so on and so forth. Now when I go into edit, then I have separate first, middle, and last names, so I can do it properly here, right? And details, all the details are there as well, okay? All right, good. Let's go to patient. Oh, that's much better, isn't it? Right? We have the nice patient name here, right? Remember that was the display name we gave for the summary property was just patient, okay? We're showing ages, the expected yearly visits, the email. Notice it's a link because of the data type that we added. We still don't have this solved, right? The fact that we're showing just the first name here for the doctors. Okay, well, we could fix that next. So if I come back to the index for the patient, okay, right now here, so we see it's model.doctor, right? So let's not leave it there. We have populated the doctor with an include, so now we can go full name, okay? And same thing down here. Well, instead of doctor first name, we'll go full name. Actually, I guess I didn't have to change this. I don't think it's going to hurt putting that there, but it wasn't really needed. Okay, so that should fix it on the index page. So let me just double check, make sure I didn't mess that up, but I'm pretty sure we're good. I should show you control. Yeah, so now we have the nice doctor and then the full name of the doctor showing. Okay, now we don't have that fixed here in the drop-down list yet. We're still having just first names here, right? Okay, so for that, let's come to, that happens on both the edit and the create page, but the trouble is it involves how the data is getting there. We did have a quick discussion about this once before, but let me bring up the patients controller. Okay, and what you're going to see, we talked about the select list business. So here in the initial create, right? So we're creating this select list data structure where we pass in a link query to give us the actual collection. And then from within that collection of objects, we say what property is used for the display text and the display value. So the display value field and then the display text field, right? And we're passing that into an object in the view data called Doctor ID. And then we pull that out on the screen and show it, right? So really, okay, if I'm getting doctors, instead of first name, hey, we now have our summary property. So I can just say full name, right? And then on my doctor create, I should see the full name instead. So I'm just going to save that. If I go, like F5 is the same shortcut to run this, but if I go Control F5, it skips debug mode, but it means that I don't have to stop and start it quite so often. Right? So if I come to patients now, if I go to create, look at my drop-down list. Okay, there's the full name. Oh, I should probably use formal name here, shouldn't I? Well, without closing the browser, notice because I did Control F5, I can change code, right? formal name. I'll just save that change, come back to the browser, and refresh. And after it refreshes, now we see it's put that change in place, right? So here are well, more or less alphabetical, but not perfect, right? Okay, that's something we didn't fix yet. We didn't make it alphabetical, right? So let's come back and talk about that. How could I make this alphabetical? Well, what I would probably tend to do is I would probably make a link query first. Instead of putting all the code in here, yeah, I could do it. I could just go dot order by and so on. But another thing we can do is practice our query. So let's go var, I don't know if I call it D query for doctor query, right? And I'm going to go from D in. I can steal this, context underscore doctors. I can add my order by D dot last name. Now here's a good point. You might think, hey, why not just use the formal name? It already has it all put together. Trouble is this query is going to be executed against the database. And the database doesn't know anything about full name, right? It doesn't understand that. It doesn't exist in the database. It just has first name, last name, and so on. So I have to order by last name, comma, then D dot first name. I could add the middle initial, but I'm not going to bother, right? Select D. Okay. So that's a nicely formed in link query using the expression syntax, right? So I can then take this and use it to provide the data to the select list. Now these are the same. I'm going to show the formal name and the internal value will be my ID, right? It's just that now I'm ordering it, okay, by last name and then first name. So it should come out alphabetical order, right? Trust me, it will. I'm not going to bother showing you that. It will be in alphabetical order. Now, the only thing is, there's, I think, 4 or 5 spots in the controller where we create the same select list, right? Because it's used in both the get for create, the post for create, and the same two for edit, right? And later on, we'll probably add it into the index as well. So 4 to 5 places. So typically what we'll do, it's not an absolute requirement, but it's good practice. Let's consolidate this code. If you have the same code being used over and over again, it's good practice to put it into a separate method, right? Okay. Now I could just do this manually, but basically this step here, because it's repeated and there's a variation of it repeated, right? Because when we do the same thing down here, the select list has an extra option. So when we're editing, okay, say there's a validation error and we come back and we have to redo something, maybe fill in information we left out. We want to reproduce the same select list, but we want to make sure if they had selected a doctor last time that it's still selected. So you notice there's an extra option here as well, right? And this option, as a parameter we pass to the select list constructor, allows us to specify, okay, this item out of the list is the one to be chosen, right? Other than that, it returns the same thing into the view data. So just being aware of all that, what we might want to do is consolidate it into a reusable function. We could do that manually, as I said, or I can highlight it like this. If I click my little thing, I can just say extract this as its own method, right? Then it keeps it highlighted while I can then type the name. So I would usually call this, as per our tutorial, something like populate drop-down lists. Now, the reason I'm saying lists is later on we'll see if sometimes you have multiple foreign keys and multiple lists that you have to create, but you're pretty much doing all of them all the time. So that's why I said list, because later on we'll see it's quite easy to add multiple select list structures into our view data so that we can be ready to populate lots of different drop-down lists. Okay, so I'm just going to click apply. So the only trouble is the way this is working right now, populate drop-down lists, only handles the case where we aren't pre-selecting a value, right? We're trying to select the last value that was selected. So we do need a variation of this. So what I would typically do is pass in the actual patient with a default value of null, because there might not be a patient to pass in. So that way I'm okay with this, right? The way it's done up here, I don't need to pass in the patient object. It'll work just fine. But then in the select list, what I'll do is I'll take advantage of the Elvis operator and say, hey, if we're given a patient, then let's include, right, the doctor ID, the foreign key of that patient. And that way we make sure that if we're displaying this for an existing record or going back because of a validation error, that the last doctor that was assigned to this patient is pre-selected in the drop-down list. Okay, so now we have this. Typically though, it's not a critical again where these sit in your code, but I typically will put new functions I add like that or new methods right down at the bottom before this patient exists. Just my habit, okay? By keeping your code organized and being consistent where you put things, it makes it easier for you to find them later on. So I'll put populate drop-down lists down here almost at the bottom, okay? Now, the thing is, I can call this from wherever I was normally doing a select list. So there's 4 spots right now. We've already fixed the first one, right? So that was in the patient create, populate drop-down lists, okay? So that's good. But we see the same thing down here, okay? The difference is this one has a pre-chosen patient. So what I'll do is we'll pass in the actual patient, right? So we have the patient object that we're working with. Okay, so this is the form that we actually use most often. It's only when you're creating a brand new patient do you not have to worry about an existing doctor. So again, same thing here. Replace that call. And so we're following the dry principle, right? Because instead of ever having, if maybe we made a change to how we want data displayed in the drop-down list, maybe we wanted it sorted a different way or something, right? Then we only ever have to modify the code for populate drop-down lists in one place. And everywhere it's called, we'll just use the new version of the code. Okay, so that's a good change to make there. So now our drop-down list will show the formal name and it's sorted alphabetically, right? Throughout the entire thing. Okay, one last little thing. I mentioned this earlier. Let me just save changes. Remember, we still have it running, so I can just come up here and refresh. Okay, and there it is, guaranteed to be alphabetical. All right. Now the one thing in edit, we're fine. Let's just double check that it's working. So yes, so the currently selected doctor was pre-selected in the list because we passed the patient in. It used the doctor ID that was already set for the patient to set the selected option in our drop-down list or select control. Okay, but when we create new, we still have this problem, right? There is a default doctor selected. So we already have, because I think in our class we planned ahead. Oh, I stopped it running. Oh, well, that's okay. Instead of doing Control F5. If we come back and look at our patient class, remember we did add, I'm pretty sure, yeah, we put a required error message here for the doctor ID. In other words, if we try to pass null, it's going to complain that we must select a primary care physician. So we're going to take advantage of that and give more feedback. So coming to patients in the views and create, we're going to modify the code here for the drop-down list. Right down here near the bottom, okay, here's our label, right, and then our select. And here's where it gets data from the doctor ID that's in the view data, that's our select list, right? So right now, it just uses the data, but we can manually, let me just come here and press enter before the closing of the select tag. And I can add my own options in here as well, and they will automatically be at the top of the list. We don't have to do anything about append data bound or anything like that. Just by putting it here, it will be above the data coming from the database. So I can say select a doctor. So now that will be the default that comes up. By setting value equals to an empty string, it means if we don't select, you actually pass null, and our required will not be happy and we'll get the chance to see our error message. Oh, wait a second. Where does it show the error message? Well, just glancing up and down, you see there are all these spans, okay? ASP validation for a given field. Class is text danger, which means red, right? So I could take one of these and just say, okay, underneath the select, I need somewhere to show the error message, only of course it's for doctor ID. And there we go. So now, when I go to create a new patient, if I don't specify the doctor ID by selecting something out of the list, I should get my error message. Right? So see it says select a doctor, and if I click create, there's my error message. So I cannot make a patient without me going in and selecting one. Okay, that's the kind of thing that it's similar to how, like, if you're going to accept, the license requirements of using something, they make you click a button, they make you pick something out of a drop-down list or check off a checkbox. You have to interact with it, otherwise you can't be held responsible. Right? Same idea. We have to force the user to choose a doctor, not just go with the default or everybody gets assigned to the first doctor. Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to, let me show you one more thing. Notice the date of birth comes up. We have our little drop-down list. Okay, we're good. But if I go back to the list, if we edit somebody that has a birth date, okay, notice it has their date filled in. Now, it's not showing the format here, but it is working, right? It shows the proper format we specified when we're displaying data. That's just it's being overridden by the actual control itself. Now, let me open a copy of Chrome and copy the URL, paste it in here, right? Notice it's the same format. That's because it's using a format set on my system. Okay, so this is Edge and that's Chrome. It's looking exactly the same. All right, but if we didn't have that set, there would probably be an issue with it not actually showing the existing value. Okay, well, that's basically it for step 2. So we fixed a lot of the issues with the display of information, right? We have a much more manageable list of information on the index. If you need to know something that is hidden here, no longer shown, like the full date of birth of the person instead of just their age or their OHIP number, you can always go to details and get all the data. And that's basically as far as you're going to have to go in the first part of the homework assignment too.